Hello, everyone. Welcome to Random Encounter 281 or 281. My name is John O'Logan, and I am back. Yes, I am back. Last week, or 2 weeks ago at this point, Zach took over the episode to talk about our Battle Bracket Game of the Year feature. And incidentally, that is still going on. We're going into the second week now, or the second round now. And I'm not sure if the feature is going to be up by the time this episode goes up. But this is in the hands of our readers to pick what is the ultimate game of the year. So please, if you are at all interested, give that episode a listen. It was a really good episode, and check out the website and follow that. It's a really, really cool feature. Anyway, so let me tell you, it's really, really hot in here right now. Yesterday it hit 20 degrees. It is unseasonably warm in Toronto, and as warm as I am, my heart is about to get even warmer because I am here with the company of two guests. And today we have Bob.
Howdy.
And we have Ben.
Hey.
Folks, there are so many games coming out right now that I desperately want to play, and frustratingly, few of them are actually RPGs or adventure games, so they're not in our coverage. For me, we have Spider-Man 2, we have Super Mario Wonder, we have Alan Wake 2, which I really, really, really want to play. We have Talos Principle 2, which I also really want to play because I love the first one. We also have a new Like a Dragon game coming out in a few weeks, and that is an RPG, so I do get to review that. But there are so many games right now, and I just wanted to ask both of you, do you ever find time to play things that, aren't in our coverage? Or are you ever driven mad by the never-ending release schedule of all these games you want to play and you just never have time to play all of them?
Actually, I find the wealth of games liberating because I can just pick the best games or the games that I know I'm going to like rather than have to swim in sevens. So, I mean, there's probably some good and entertaining games that are sevens. There's nothing wrong with a seven, but if I could play exclusively nines and tens, that seems much better to me. As for the first part of the question, I do find some time to play some games that aren't in our coverage. Typically, I have an hour or two some nights with my sister, and we play a lot of cooperative games online together. So those tend to be more actiony than anything else because co-ops tend to be actiony or puzzly. And then now that I have a daughter who's now 5, I'm introducing her to Mario, so I'm playing a lot of Mario stuff on the Wii.
Oh, the Wii.
Yeah, Super Mario Galaxy, man. You can't beat it. One of the goats.
Here.
Yeah.
No complaint here. Super Mario Galaxy is one of the greatest Mario games and one of the greatest games ever. It's brilliant.
That's right. Yep.
Oh, so good. I mean, I love Mario. Super Mario Wonder looks so good. I just need to find time to actually buy it and download it and then play it. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I most of current stuff, I find I really only play stuff for the site now. I mean, I haven't been on the site for super long, but since I've been on the site, most of the modern stuff I play is for the site. But I like to play a lot of retro games, and so I find time for that outside of just what I do for the site. So.
Well, let's have a little chat about two games that you actually have played. And the first one, this is going to be an episode in contrast because we're going to be swinging back and forth between the horror of the supernatural and also cute doggos in armor. So let's talk World of Horror. So Bob, you reviewed this a little while ago. It was a game that was in early access for many years, but it finally got a 1.0 release. And just before we really get into the game and everything, I'm just curious, did it make a significant jump into the full-fledged 1.0, or should it have stayed on early access just for a little while longer?
Oh man, if you ask the community, they have very strong opinions about this. There are people who supported this game years ago when it hit early access, and the updates over time were minimal. And then there was quite a bit of dead air until it hit 1.0, and people were speculating it's because they wanted it on Switch. So the developers were trying to sell more games, which makes sense. It's a business. But the customers who support it on Steam were pretty frustrated because it didn't get a lot of quality life stuff that was promised, and there still seems to be content missing. You could go through the menus of the very difficult to navigate UI and see that some things just aren't there yet. And it's a 1.0 release, which is kind of weird. That being said, I try to only experience things once they hit full release. And while I've enjoyed it, I can understand the frustration of people who were devout followers for many years.
Well, let's actually talk about what this thing is, because it is a game that I remember you and I talking about it, years ago, and creating a card for it, but also deciding, let's wait until this thing's actually out. And we waited quite some time. But it had this incredible visual style and look about it. And in the review, and I guess this is what it is, it's a combination of Junji Ito's visual style and H.P. Lovecraft's themes. So, I mean, I suspect that most of our listeners know who Lovecraft is, but can you tell us, Junji Ito, why is his name so important here? Like, how does he come into the world of horror?
Well, Junji Ito is a manga artist and storyteller in Japan, who has very much their own unique horror style and art style. A lot of their work has to do with things that are similar to Lovecraft, where like people go mad and then do things that a sane person would not do,
Hmm.
and it can be for all sorts of reasons. Like Uzumaki is a manga that was adapted into a film, and has to do with this town where people, for some reason, became obsessed with spirals, and people start trying to find spirals in daily life. Their bodies contort in ways that manifest as spirals, and the pull here is it's just so bizarre and otherworldly. You've not seen anything like it before. Like, we all know slasher flicks, we all know zombie films, but this brand of horror is the only kind of horror in, I would say, modern culture that even approaches Lovecraft style, which is mostly based on text and
Mhm.
igniting the reader's imagination. Junji Ito puts that to paper with a pen, which is quite a feat to accomplish. And I think World of Horror captures a lot of that styling fantastically.
Yeah, when I first saw the game, I mean, well, right off the bat, it's a one bit visual style. Like, there are two colors, there is black and there is white. And with it does amazing things with those two colors. And also it's a menu driven game as well, which is fascinating. When I first saw it, I thought that we would be dealing with pretty much a pure adventure game, but this is actually an RPG.
I guess it is kind of an RPG, technically speaking. There is combat, it is turn based, but it feels a lot like old PC games where you're like, you have a whole suite of choices to make, and they're not always hit the enemy. It eventually does devolve into hitting enemy, but you have options like finding a weapon, having an ally distract the enemy for you, trying to study the enemy, pray to expel a ghost enemy. There's lots of like little choices here that, while I'm describing and hearing myself say it out loud, it sounds interesting. But in reality, what ends up happening is you're managing a stamina bar of, say, 200 energy points, and
Mhm.
swinging a broken bottle might take X amount of points. And you're just trying to be as efficient as possible and kill this thing while taking the least amount of damage. So it ends up being a number crunching game. And the battle component, which I would say is more the RPG aspect of it, I think is probably the weakest part of it.
Interesting. I mean, there are a lot of. I mean, horror games nowadays are they're not a dime a dozen, but they're fairly prevalent in the world of video games at this point. And I'm curious how other games that combined horror and RPG elements, how this compares to them. Let's, for example, one that is not recent. This is 20 to 30 years old at this point almost, but it is Japanese too, like Corpse Party, for example. Like, how does this compare to those other games that may blend horror and RPG together?
I've not played Corpse Party. Um, Sweet Home,
There's
which
a good one,
we're
yeah.
talking retro, like that is I would say probably the first horror like video game released ever. A lot of people credit it with being the inspiration for Resident Evil. So
Borderline a prototype.
exactly. So Sweet Home is an NES RPG, and you're basically trying to get through a mansion that you're stuck inside with a party of just random people. You're not fighters, you're not like adept at martial arts or anything. You're just trying to survive, and you run into all sorts of horror type things. You're navigating a map top down like you would in a Final Fantasy game,
Mm.
and then eventually you get in these combats, and they're very simple, being NES era. So I would say this is very similar in that respect. The difference being between World of Horror and that game is, while there are RPG elements, I think what draws people more to World of Horror is not just the artistic style, but also the writing. What they try to do in World of Horror is really try to establish what Lovecraft so expertly does with his text,
Mhm.
and what Junji Ito does with his manga, which is, you read a line, you hear dialogue, and someone turns around, and all of a sudden they're not who you thought they were.
Mm.
And it's more trying to ignite the imagination, whereas Sweet Home was more like an adventure RPG where you're like trying to get to the end so you can get out, beat the big baddie, all that stuff, which feels like a lot of other RPGs. This game is very much you're experiencing stories in small bits that eventually leads to a grand finale.
Yeah, the short story format is very interesting because rather than like an overarching plot, it's almost, well, in a way episodic almost. Like each
Mhm.
it from what I've read and from what I've seen, there's like a you pick your playable character and there's like a board full of cases that you can investigate.
Mhm.
So basically it uses an almost roguelike structure to tell short stories in the horror genre.
Yeah, it is a roguelike. It really does blend a lot of genres here. The roguelike aspect, as you said, is every time you load up the game, you choose a character, or you can randomize it. You get 5 random scenarios. You have no choice over what scenarios pop up, and the game has quite a few. You will eventually see repeats more often than you would like,
Hmm.
and then each of these scenarios can be solved in different ways. So they'll have multiple endings. Some have 2 endings, 3, and then if you're lucky, one will have 4. Um, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to, of course, solve these 5 mysteries, which are about 10 to 15, maybe 20-minute episodes. If you're new, it'll probably be 20 minutes. And
Mhm.
then after that's done, you get 5 keys for solving the 5 mysteries. And then you go into an abandoned lighthouse. And then you climb the lighthouse, encounter things that you've seen many times before in previous playthroughs. And then you get to the top and then you defeat the big baddie. Now, there's multiple endings I have not achieved, and it's kind of a puzzle game in that respect. It's like, how else am I supposed to beat this game? Because I
Mhm.
keep getting the same ending, which could be a little frustrating because what you're doing is you're just grinding out the same content you've seen again and again and again. So if like 3 of the 5 mysteries are ones you've played before, you could kind of try to go for a different ending, but it's still, even if you get that different ending, a lot of what you're seeing is going to be a regurgitation of what you've already seen before.
And that will
Now, it
get
sounds
very
like,
repetitive, yeah.
yes, it does. But if you're in for like, you just want like a 5-hour thing, this game is fantastic for that because what it does when things are fresh and new is it does give you that Junji Ito vibe. And you're like,
Mhm.
wow, this is good horror. This is fascinating. I don't think you're going to be scared, but you're going, if you're into the macabre at all, if you're into horror at all and like, madness and that aspect of horror, you're going to love what's presented here. But if you're trying to like complete this game, you're going to be clicking through a lot of dialogue and episodes you've seen time and time again. So it's more like pulling a slot machine arm than it is experiencing and immersing yourself in a game.
Well, you mentioned the introductory mission. You have there's a first mission that kind of branches off, and how does it set the tone for the rest of the game?
I mean, you're basically introducing yourself to the world in that you do a few brief stories that feel a lot like the stories you'll experience in the roguelike aspect of it.
Mhm.
But it's so easy and short lived, it doesn't even really feel like a game in itself. It's literally just like a tutorial.
Okay.
These are the buttons you press,
Mhm.
and then this is how you navigate battle, and like you get little pop-up windows. But the thing about it is, even after the tutorial, you feel like you don't know everything you need to know. There's still so many different buttons, and it being 2 different colors, it can be exhausting to the eyes. There's just stuff everywhere on the screen. And if you go in your inventory, there's stuff everywhere. If you go into your status, if you go into an item, there's buttons everywhere. And it's just like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. A lot of it is not well explained.
Mhm.
So the tutorial does a good job of getting you running and learning as you go, which is also kind of a roguelike trait. Like roguelikes tend not to hold your hand too much. It's kind of like, hey, figure it out. And that's part of the fun and charm of a roguelike. But with UI like this, I would have hoped that it would have been more player friendly.
Hmm. I think it's fascinating the way this game looks. Now, first off, it's set in 1984 Japan,
Nah.
which very interesting setting. And I imagine that setting it in that time period was intentional because of the graphic style being what it
Mhm.
is, which is known as 1 bit. Interesting to note that 1 bit is not really. It's more of an artistic style than it is an actual video game system. Uh, yeah, so basically 1 bit means that you have 2 colors, black, white, and if you want like gradients, if you want like gray, then you basically put like lots of little black dots on a white background to fool the eye. And it's an extraordinarily striking graphic style that was also used in such games as like Obra Dinn, for example. Um,
Yes. Oh, now that's a phenomenal game.
Oh, you're not wrong about that. You are not wrong about that at all. So, how does the game actually play into the night? Like it's set in 1984. How does that play into the actual game itself?
Well, I mean, there's small little hints everywhere. I don't feel like I'm in 1984 Japan. There's no city pop that's playing. On the other hand, there's cord phones, so like
Hmm.
there's telephone booths, there's things like that. We do not have the technology of today, which kind of adds to the horror if you think about it, because you can't
Hmm.
just like call for help, just pull your phone out of your pocket, call for help. You don't have that access. So it could feel a little more isolated in that respect. But I'm even stretching when I say that. I think the 1984 aspect of it is cool in that, like you said before, this is a 1-bit game. It feels like a retro game. It feels like you're
Hmm.
playing an old PC game. I would say what World of Horror is best at is style. It's got good vibes. It feels like an old game, and at the same time it is still pleasing to the eye, which I think is
Mhm.
incredible that they were able to achieve that. Like, it's two colors, how good can it actually look? And while it's not animated, most of it's still images. The trailers and videos online would make you think you're playing through some cinematic scenes. There's no cinematic scenes.
Hmm.
It is just all still images, which that's an our bone a lot of people pick with this game, is like you're kind of misrepresenting what the game is. But the writing is good and the artistic style is good.
Well,
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I played quite a bit of this with my wife watching, and then we're
mhm,
like trying to puzzle out how to solve the mysteries in different ways.
mhm.
But I it's so sad to me because they've got a good thing here. It's just the repetition of the limited content is pretty frustrating.
Yeah, it's a real shame because, like you said, the game. I guess you could say some people would argue that this is not a looker, but the reality is it depends on what you value in graphics and visuals. Like if HD, super high resolution, monitor melting frame rates, is that how you clock visuals? Then yeah, this game's not going to cut it. But if you have a thing for developers who pick a visual design and then stick with it and expand it and just stick with it to an absurd degree in many cases, then this is the kind of game that really might be for you. And because of that, it is very pleasing to the eye because of its visual style.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, you got to be in for this. And you can, the nice thing about a game like this is you can look at it and know if it's for you or not. If you need those AAA graphics, you're like a Call of Duty guy or whatever, or like you only play Final Fantasies or latest Atlas game, you might look at this and be like, this looks like crap. But if
Mhm.
you're like into this retro style and you want a unique experience, you want some unique writing, you're into the gore and this disturbingness that horror can bring,
Mhm.
this game is for you for at least 5 hours.
Yeah, I mean, the visual styling and the static nature of it to me means that it's going to be much more creepy than scary. It's going to be a vibe. How does the music play into that vibe? Out of curiosity.
Oh, it's got good music that accentuates the vibe of it. If you've read my Videoverse review, which this is probably my game of the year right now, Videoverse, phenomenal game. It's got the same sort of music in that the music is like almost MIDI quality
Hmm.
in order to complement the visual style. Like, it would be very unusual if there was like an orchestral soundtrack for a game like this. It just wouldn't fit. Even if that orchestral soundtrack sounded good, it would be discordant. And I think
Mm.
with a game like this, if you can have some high quality music that sounds like it's from the era, it's a lot of dupes and beats and things like that. I think you're going to enjoy the whole package for sure.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like the sound design needs to complement the game's visual presentation, and it does in a way that, frankly speaking, like you said, if it was orchestral, there would be a disconnect between those two things. So, from what I'm gathering here, the big problem with the game is that it relies really heavily on the quality of its writing and visuals, but then once you've exhausted all of the randomized events that you experience and you start getting repeats in the roguelike structure, the game doesn't really have a decent sense of progression to it.
Yeah, it just feels like you're kind of spinning your wheels. Now, to its credit, there are really cool achievements you could do for doing unique things,
Mhm.
and those achievements will unlock new cards or new events or even challenges, which is a whole different kind of game you could play where you intentionally take on a handicap so that you can have a greater challenge. So the achievements are cool because they do add some replay value. Uh, that being said, when you go into a mission, like the actual gameplay is you go into a mission and it's about 10 to 15 minutes or whatever.
Mhm.
And then the game will say like, "Oh, you're worried about your friend at your apartment." And then there's like a white circle that hovers over this little map on a square that shows your apartment. You click on the apartment and you'll have an event that isn't even related to what you're going there to do. It's just a random event. It's like,
Hmm.
you hear a disturbing noise down the hallway. Do you check it? And then you can choose, yeah, I check it, or you say, I don't check it. And then if you decide either one, it'll do a skill check against one of your stats. And then you'll say, you succeeded or you failed. And it's just like rolling dice.
Hmm.
And that's it. So, like, you got to guess, like, oh, this sounds like a perception check. I'm good at perception. I'm going to check what's down the hallway. Whereas if you got a weak perception, you'd be like, yeah, you know what? I'm not going to do that. And then you click, decide to stay here. So that's kind of the strategy behind it, is like, what kind of skill check am I using to do these very quick snippets of checks? Sometimes there aren't even checks though. Like you'll just find a spider. So like if you go to the docks, it's like giant spider bites you in the arm. Now you have an injury. It's like,
Hmm.
cool. And I've seen that encounter 3 times. Like every time I'm like,
Ah.
oh, this again. And there's no agency in it. I have no choice over like what happens. I just get bit by a spider. Now I get this wound in my arm that may or may not become something that really hurts my character down the road.
Mhm.
So things, if you're like a hardcore gamer and you want like grit and you want like strategy and you want to be able to puzzle your way through the gameplay, this isn't for you. This is for like lean back in your chair and just experience the horror as it comes.
Interesting. It's a real shame that there's, I guess, in this kind of game, they are limited by the amount of content that they can create. It seems like it would be an ideal game for DLC cases or even possibly user-generated content. Although in that particular case, it would have to be probably reusing visuals that have already been there and recontextualizing them. It seems like this would really work with some good old-fashioned DLC.
Yeah, and the DLC would have to be probably either free or cheap because
Mm.
it's already a $20 game for what I would argue is 5 maybe 10 hours worth of gameplay.
Hmm.
Um, I think modding could work really well. Like you said, they might have to reuse assets, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes people in the mod community who are like enthusiasts will just run away with this and they'll
Mm.
introduce their own visual style. Like people who are like passionate or obsessed with the game, they could really surprise you. But I think mods could absolutely blow this game wide open.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially because I mean, mods tend to break every game wide open. At least good games, or they
Yes.
make a good game better. In the case of Fallout 4, for example, or any of the Fallout games for that
Dark
matter.
Souls
Yeah,
made Dark Souls playable back in the day.
yeah. It's interesting. This visual style, one bit visual style, clearly it's not going anywhere. It's used for a number of reasons. It's not exactly easy to use. In fact, arguably using one bit visuals is way harder because you're taking away a valuable tool, which is color. But
Yeah.
I mean, there's a place for it. In fact, we have the Playdate, the little handheld console with the crank, which I really
Hmm.
want one. Yeah, that's pretty much using entirely Game Boy-esque, very, one bit style of graphics.
Yeah, and there's a whole community of people who want that dramatically, is the nostalgia aspect of it. But I think it's also, and I said this in my Videoverse review, is like it's incredible what people can achieve when you limit their resources.
Oh
All of a
yeah,
sudden, it ignites creativity, which is like counterintuitive. You would say, like, wait, by limiting my tools, I'm able to create something that's more unique and more creative. It's like, yeah, because you have to think differently to make a good, high quality game in today's environment. Like you said, we're inundated with choice. How is your game going to stand out?
true. And I mean, in art, effort results in creativity, and if you are given constraints, you need to put more effort in, which therefore has more creativity as an output. Um, and I think that's a very, very interesting thing that many AAA games probably will not explore, at least not for a good many years, until there's got to be a point where indies finally make that, where AAA games finally realize, indies are eating our lunch at a tenth of the cost we're spending. Maybe we should delve into this world a little bit.
I mean, I think that's why like Microsoft's trying to buy up smaller studios, is because they realize indies are able to accomplish a lot with a lot of creativity that
mm,
maybe some AAA studios or like veteran developers are not achieving.
yeah. Well, Bob, before we finish talking about this, I wanted to give you a recommendation. I may have given you this recommendation already because you mentioned sitting on the couch with your wife playing this game. And if you're looking for something that will give you what I think you were looking for in this game and didn't quite get, just get the case of the Golden Idol. Um, get and play it with your wife on the couch.
Yeah.
Amanda and I played the entirety of the case of Golden Idol together on the couch, figuring out these puzzles. It's unbelievably good.
Okay. Yeah. No, this definitely seems up my alley.
Oh, and
Yeah, I can
if you
see
want to
exactly why you're recommending it.
if you want a very, very identifiable visual style, it isn't one bit, but oh my god, it is the ugliest looking game I've played in years. But it's an ugly game in a very intentional, good way.
Yeah, no, it's ugly in the best way. And I like games that can do that. Is
Yep.
again, at this point, I've been playing games for like over 30 years. Like I need something unique.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's an artistic style, like if you're doing something different, I'm in.
Oh yeah, and I mean this is the best mystery game I've played since Oberdin, and
Ooh,
it might be comparable to Oberdin in terms of what it does. It's a very
that's high
different
praise.
it's a very different game. However, it's just as in depth and really, Bob, you just got to play it. And again, it's perfect for, I wouldn't exactly call it couch co-op, but
Yeah.
that kind of let's sit down together and let's play a game. I recommend it to you, recommend it to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we also have a review for it. So if you at any point you play it and you're like, okay, got to talk about this. Yeah. Okay, sure. Um, anyway, okay, we're going to swing away from the world of horror and go into the world of war. There's a lot of horror in war, but I sincerely doubt there's a whole lot of horror in Wargroove 2. So, Wargroove 2. Wargroove was released in 2019, and it was kind of presented as a spiritual successor to the Nintendo Wars series, so Advanced Wars. And while it used swords and sorcery instead of guns and tanks, it did feature a very similar cartoony style, colorful art style. It had over-the-top commander characters with special abilities, and it had very, very similar gameplay. And frankly speaking, I just freaking loved it. I mean, I really, really like Advanced Wars. I reviewed it back when it came out. I gave it a 91. Just honestly, a really terrific, terrific game with so much content. It was way beyond just the campaign. There were multiple races. There was the creation tools for folks who wanted to create their own maps and even create their own campaigns were very, very generous. And now we have a sequel, and I remember when this was announced, no one was expecting it, and it's a sequel just a few years later. It's Wargroove 2, and Ben, you recently reviewed it.
Yes, I did, and I very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, I guess my first question, which is actually going to be the most important question, the doggos are still unkillable, right?
Yeah, they run away.
Okay, that would have a betrayal on a level that no one could forgive if you could kill the dogs. That was one of the best things about Wargroove is that you couldn't kill the dogs. Whenever the dogs would lose, they would just run. Um, all right. Well, why don't you give us an
There are
overview?
cats in this one, actually. So
There are cats in this one?
yeah. The well, we can get into that, but there's a new race.
I know there's a
Of
race of mice.
Yes, and their cavalry units ride cats, which is very funny.
That is a really nice.
That's the twist. That's the hook. It's like Wargroove 2, we got cats.
Wargroove 2. We now can ride cats. Well, why don't you give us an overview of Wargroove 2 and what it brings to the table?
Yeah, so Wargroove 2 is actually really interesting because the focus of the game I feel like is pretty different than the focus of Wargroove 1, where the first game is, it's definitely much lighter in tone. It's a lot more focused on just like introducing you to the characters and the world they inhabit, and then kind of throwing together some situations in which they would fight, which is very similar to like the original Advance Wars games on the Game Boy Advance, right? Like the pretense for why war is happening can be kind of thin, but you don't really care because it has more of like a board game style feel to it, right? But Wargroove 2 is it's I would almost say like what Tears of the Kingdom is to Breath of the Wild is what Wargroove 2 is to Wargroove 1. So
Ooh.
it's entirely based on like recontextualizing the characters and relationships and state of the world in Wargroove 1, and then building off of that into something that's really narratively very interesting, has a lot of character development, and like since you reviewed Wargroove 1, I don't think those are the first two things that would be off your tongue when describing
No.
Wargroove 1.
But
that
super,
is like
super great characters. Like the characters in it are very, very lovable. But yeah, it's not. This goes deeper, is what you're saying.
Yeah, very much so. And based on the events and relationships that were established in Wargroove 1 in a way that's really interesting and something I really did not expect going into the game. And I was really, really impressed with that. You've got things like young queer romance happening in the story of Wargroove 2. You have, like a portrayal of imperialism and the costs and harm that imperialism does to the colonized people. You've got like a strained parent and child relationship between the Fell King Valder and his the like Frankenstein like daughter that he created, Ragna, from the first game. And it's just super, super interesting how they took the lore and basic characters and elements from the first game and tried to do something really interesting narratively with it. So, and that's something that you don't really think about when you think Advance Wars either, is like, oh, a really gripping story with really interesting characters, but they really knocked it out of the park as far as the narrative and characters go in this one.
Let's talk about some of the new factions that are introduced in this game. So in the original one, we had, I believe, the Cherrystone Kingdom, which was led by, I know her name is Mercia, but whenever I look at her name, I just think Murica. And you have multiple other kingdoms, including basically a plant kingdom, a kingdom of sand, things like this.
Yeah, there's the Florins, who are the plant people, and then there's the Heaven Song Empire, which is based loosely on like Japanese culture, and they're more technologically advanced. And then you have
the
undead, which is Valder, who is the ruler of the Felheim, the undead kingdom, because he has the Fel Gauntlet, which brings the dead back to life.
Where are we in this? Like, what new factions are introduced?
So there's one new faction introduced, which is the Mice people that we mentioned before. They're called the Fari Republic, and they come from a different continent. So they are actually appear on the continent as part of an expedition. So it's like a scholarly expedition where they're trying to learn more about the ancient culture that was there before the current countries, which I believe is like cacophony or something like that, and trying to unearth their artifacts and learn about their technology and everything. And of course, that technology and the influence of that technology is what caused the conflict in the first Wargroove. So when they're trying to unearth these artifacts, they run afoul of the Florins, who that's just the part of the world that they happen to run aground upon with their expedition. And so they come into conflict with them. And so that kind of creates an interesting situation where it's kind of like shades of gray, where, the Fari are just, in pursuit of like, it's a scholarly pursuit, right? They're just trying to learn more about this history, but they don't know the danger that's present in these ancient artifacts. And the Florins do. So the Florins are attempting to stop them, and then that causes the conflict, right? So, and they're kind of a little bit like the Heaven Song Empire, because they're more technologically advanced, but they have more of a desert, a little bit of like a Middle Eastern vibe to their kind of aesthetic and culture and stuff.
Yeah, and we also have pirates, who are actually introduced in the DLC for Wargroove, but they're here as a much more fleshed out faction, essentially.
Yes, so the Outlaws, they get their own campaign where you play as Wolfar, who is the leader of the Outlaw faction and the father of the two twins who were introduced in the co-op campaign that was added as DLC to Wargroove 1. And he actually goes to the Saffron Isles, which is a region that's being actively colonized by the Heaven Song Empire. And so he's sent there by Cherrystone to kind of see what's going on, because they have heard like disturbing reports about what Heaven Song is doing there, and they send him as kind of like an agent undercover to see, what is happening if they need to intervene. And what's interesting about that is that his wife and the mother of his kids is from that region. So he comes across her sister, who is Nadia, who is a pirate leading the resistance against the Heaven Song Empire. And so he joins them, and then they fight back against Heaven Song. Yeah.
Well, obviously, the storyline is considerably more fleshed out and seemed to have some more stakes than the original. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is the original kind of there were different factions, but it only had like one real campaign. How many different campaigns are available in Wargroove 2?
So there are 5 campaigns total. With there's like the initial like tutorial campaign, which then leads into the Fari campaign, which is the new group of the mice people.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Felheim's campaign, then you have the Outlaw campaign, and then there's the final campaign, which is when everybody comes together for the final, battle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one nice thing about this game compared to the original is that a lot of people complain that because the original was the one long campaign, you had to kind of progress linearly in it, that a lot of it felt like it was a tutorial.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're introducing the mechanics slowly, and took a really long time before you got to different unit types, and that sort of thing. So one interesting thing they do with this is that the initial 3 campaigns can be completed in any order, and they each focus on different unit types. So the Fari campaign focuses entirely on ground units. The Felheim campaign introduces air units, and then the Outlaw campaign introduces sea units.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of pick based on what your preference is, and then you get to higher level play in those campaigns a lot quicker, because since they're only introducing one new set of units, they can then take those to the heights of what is strategically possible with those unit types within a much quicker period than what they did in the first one. So
Are there new unit types in this game?
there are some new unit
Okay.
types, and kind of oddly, like they're heavier on the new unit types for C units. I think there's only like 1 or 2 new ground units and 1 or 2 new air units, and then there's like 4 new C units.
I don't think that's strange, because if I recall correctly, I very much enjoy ground-based combat in both Wargroove and in Advance Wars. Sea combat's never been my favorite in either of those games, so I think that possibly the sea is the place where the most innovation can happen in terms of unit balance and things like that.
Yeah, and those new units that they add to the C units are probably the most interesting mechanically, because you have a lot of units that can like push or pull enemy units. They even added a unit that can capture bases
Mm-hmm.
from C. So they got like a lot more versatile compared to where they were, which was mostly like either countering air units or ranged attacks on ground units, which is kind of what they're limited to in Wargroove 1 and then in Advance Wars as well.
Yeah, it's
Um,
interesting because one of the problems I guess with releasing a sequel like this is, especially Wargroove, through various patches and community feedback and stuff, as I think the balance changed from when I played it, but I believe from what I've read, it got really good. Like the balance got fantastic in this game, but by introducing a single new unit, the balance is completely thrown out of whack.
mhm.
Um, and do you feel that here, or did they strike the proper balance with the units?
Yeah, I think that's hard. I think Wargroove has some slight mechanical differences from Advance Wars, which I think impact the balance pretty significantly just in general. So the major thing would be, if you haven't played Wargroove before at all and you've played Advance Wars, Advance Wars only infantry can capture.
Hmm.
Well, in Wargroove, that's also true, but like half of the units are a type of infantry.
Yeah.
So, like a lot of units can capture, and that plays a big role in the balance, because now all of a sudden, like half your roster is a big threat to the opponent's headquarters or
Hmm.
other bases, because they can capture a bunch of units, and it's not so much about ferrying weaker infantry units and protecting them to get them to a place where they can then capture. Most of your strongest units can capture, and the new units they did, I think it helps the balance a little, because now there's an air unit that can capture and there's a sea unit that can capture, so
Hmm.
you never feel like those units are just less, that those bases or those production facilities are like just flat out less useful, because you can kind of do all the stuff with each of them if you need to.
Hmm.
But they there's still those kind of inherent balance problems that are in the game.
Yeah.
um,
I mean, a game like this has to be absolute madness to try and balance.
Oh
Like I
yeah.
cannot imagine as a game designer, you got to have a passion for this because like you said before, John, like you tweak one thing, the whole thing falls apart.
Oh God, yes. I mean, it's what if chess, but instead of it being the small little grid with this many pieces, you have a massive map, and and you just have tons and tons of different units. Like it gets exponentially. Designing a strategy game, either turn based or like this, or a game like StarCraft, must be a ever ending nightmare to try to figure out the proper balance between the various races and their units.
Or you think you've nailed it, and then like some guy shows up and they're like, "Oh yeah, just do this and this."
Some asshole with a YouTube tutorial
Yeah,
breaks the
it's like
game.
back to the drawing board. Oh god.
Yeah, and one way I think the balance is good though is the unique aspect of Wargroove is that you have the on-field commanders,
Mm-hmm.
and so they are like an individual unit, and they are very powerful. But if they die, then you lose the match, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if the opponents dies, they also lose the match. So that creates kind of an interesting risk reward because they are simultaneously like your most powerful unit at all times, and they're also like your biggest priority in terms of protecting them. And so that I think the grooves, which are like the CO powers from Advance Wars that each character has, I think are actually really well balanced. The new characters, their new grooves are all really useful, and they feel like they have their place without being like overpowered. So that's one way I think they really did nail the balance, is that all
Mm-hmm.
the commanders are interesting to play. They all have their unique role, and none of them really feel like underpowered or overpowered compared to the others.
See, it's interesting. We were talking about early access a few minutes ago with World of Horror, whereas I feel like a game like Wargroove or let's say again StarCraft or those kind of things, these games can really benefit from early access in the sense that they can teach the developers about balance in a way that I suspect just internal testing can't. Because there's only so like just personal preferences. Even if you actively fight against it, personal preferences in terms of combat styles develop. Whereas if you give the game to somebody else, and they are likely to use all of the tools in a completely different way. But this thing didn't have early access; it just dropped like like a surprise. So the fact that it's this well balanced off the top is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and they're very much building on the mechanics that were established in the first game.
Mm.
So I think that was beneficial to them. You're not really reinventing the wheel, so you can kind of build off what you learned with the first game and what they added over time with updates and everything,
Mm.
and then start from a really solid place so that when you add new things, it doesn't really necessarily upset the whole apple cart because they've already got so much experience with different variables and stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um, let's talk about like you mentioned, there are multiple campaigns in this game, but much like the original, there are also various styles of play. For example,
Mm-hmm.
there is conquest mode.
Yeah. So that's the new like there's the new roguelike kind of mode. And that is where you'll like pick a commander, and then you go with different nodes on this map, and they're like randomly generated what different events will take place. There are battles that you'll fight,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually has permadeath. So you're given a certain amount of units at the start, and then if those units die, then they're dead, and you can't produce any more of units
Hmm.
just on command or anything. And then you're trying to get to the end of that map, with enough units to like complete it,
Mm.
basically. And at different nodes, there'll be you can get like buffs, or you can produce new units or do other things depending on which route you take. And so I thought that was a really interesting mode. It definitely has it has different like tactical considerations compared to just like a normal game of Wargroove, where you're not your priorities are different. That's the thing about Advance Wars and Wargroove compared to maybe something like Fire Emblem, is that your units are typically very disposable, because you can just create new ones for a relatively low cost
Mm-hmm.
from your production facilities. But the roguelike mode really makes you value each individual unit because they're not easily replaced, and so it's just a very different style of a gameplay. And I thought that was really unique and interesting. And it also recontextualizes a lot of the commanders and their abilities, because suddenly, like, an ability that feels maybe not as great, like Mercia's heal, is suddenly super useful in the roguelike mode.
No, I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, there are also other modes besides that, including a return of many of the custom creation tools that were in the original. So, like, that was the brilliant thing about Wargroove, is that once you finished the game, if you wanted to keep playing Wargroove and you didn't just want to do random battles, you actually wanted to get an experience. Again, the fans could step in and they could create insane things that the developers, in many cases, never would have dreamed of.
Yeah, and that's one way in which I think Wargroove 2 really puts Advance Wars to shame. So I was on Random earlier this year talking about Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp. And one of my major disappointments with that remake is that the online and creation features were so limited. Now, in that game, in Advance Wars Reboot Camp, there's a great map editor that you can use and everything, just like the original games. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to share maps with other people. They basically have to be on your friends list. You can only have a very small amount of maps at one time. And then trying to do online multiplayer is like so difficult and needlessly limited in Advance Wars. And Wargroove 2 is like the complete opposite. It's super easy to create levels with the level editor, upload them, download either individual levels or full campaigns that other players have created. The online features are really robust. There's online lobbies, which, it's crazy that we're in 2023 and, Nintendo still doesn't have like lobbies in their game released this year. But Wargroove 2 has player lobbies. You can join with another player and you can browse the server list and pick which map you want to play or under which rule set the other players picked and everything, or create your own room and have random people join you. So the online features and the user creation features are really robust, and they're very easy and painless. So if you like to play these kind of games online against other people, then I would definitely recommend getting Wargroove, because it's like the best kind of experience that you can get for that kind of turn-based tactical game for multiplayer.
Yeah. Well, here's my
and it's
final...
$20. That's the other thing. It's only $20. Very cheap.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. But actually, my question is, first off, I think the game looks absolutely terrific. I love the graphic style of this. It does look, it's a direct sequel. It uses the same engine. It's a direct sequel. It looks identical. And from what I've heard, it also sounds very similar. There are new compositions, and the music in the original was great. So I suspect the music here is good too.
Yes. Yeah, it's very good.
Here's my question, though. If you were to recommend this to someone new to the series, a turn-based strategy fan, would you recommend that they play this, or would you recommend they immediately start with Wargroove 1?
That's interesting. It's an interesting question, because it does rely so heavily on what's established with 1. But I think that if you're someone who's going into a turn-based strategy game like this and you really want a really gripping story with good characters, I would say you're actually fine to start with this one. And that's because, that's much more of a focus with this game. And the original story, like, while it does like set up all the characters in the world that are, used to really great effect in Wargroove 2, there's not really anything super significant, like story-wise, that you would really be missing out on by not playing 1 first. Because it's just not the focus of Wargroove 1. And then, it does a really good job with the tutorials and everything and easing you into the gameplay, that there's not really any major barriers in terms of if you were a first-time player, I don't think. I had forgotten a lot of the story details from Wargroove 1, because it had come out like 4 years ago. So, I wasn't completely like new player fresh coming in, but basically they do a really good job of like reminding you of what happened in the past and why it's relevant now. So
interesting. Well, Thank you both for coming on and talking about these games. One thing before we go, I have a discussion question from a reader, actually, from D Brown, and their question is, and this is, let me just preface this. This is a question that we ask ourselves pretty much constantly. How do you feel about games that are not RPGs having more RPG elements added to them? Is it good that mechanics you enjoy in RPGs are showing up in more genres, or does it dilute RPGs from their own identity? Now, like I said, this is an age-old question that we ask ourselves regularly. Like, what even is an RPG anymore? But like, can we cover Spider-Man 2? Is Spider-Man 2 an RPG? I kind of wish it was. I don't think it is. So I don't want to focus on that aspect of it. Instead, I'd like to talk about how do we feel about games that are not RPGs having more RPG mechanics added to them? Let's talk about how the mechanics of RPGs work and why or why not they should be put into other genres. I guess my idea, my perspective on this is, yeah, go to it. It's great. I think it's fantastic. Yes, it does tend to make RPGs a little bit less unique, but in terms of progression, there are few systems, there are a few video games that have as the character progression is as fun as RPGs, where you have that level of customizability to make your character your own, to play the role. And when that is imported into pretty much any other genre, it does give you a sense of ownership over the character, even if the game itself isn't an RPG. And you can see this in many fighting games now. I mean, arguably, Street Fighter 6 does have tremendous RPG elements, or even beat 'em ups, like, for example, most recently, the River City, like the more recent River City games, have a lot of RPGs elements in them to the point where, yeah, we theoretically could cover it. And that's tricky for us at RPG Fan because we don't have the resources to cover every single game that comes out as much as we wish that we did. And yes, an argument can be made for everything. Like, I wish that I could argue that Alan Wake 2 falls much more in line with the adventure game coverage, but it doesn't quite get there. Spider-Man 2, even though it does have RPG elements, doesn't quite get there. But I think putting RPG elements into other games is totally fine. Most RPG mechanics are character progression based, and that just improves a game's feel, in my opinion.
Beautifully stated. I think what you just said, Jono, hits the nail on the head. As long as it's done well, right?
Oh yeah.
I don't care what genres you're melding, as long as you do it well. Like you can mix, like, Crypta Necrodancer mixes rhythm with RPG and roguelike elements.
Mhm.
Like, why not? Like, I think that makes a unique experience. Like, I've never seen anyone do that before, yet it's done well. As long as you can do it well, I don't think we have to admire RPGs as being this unique thing. Like, don't touch RPGs; they got to be their own thing. We have traditional RPGs like Atlas Games, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy. Those are, your core traditional RPGs. Those aren't going anywhere.
Mhm.
So the fact that we're sharing the love, I think, is a benefit to all of us because it's, again, innovation. Leveling up, having stats, I think that taps into something in our core of, like, a dopamine rush. Ding, level up. Cool. All right, what new toys do I get? This is, like, as old as time. Like, everyone loves that stuff.
Mhm.
So I say go for it. As long as you can do it well, as long as it's not repetitive. Oh, we've seen this before. Like, if you could do something creatively, I'm all for it. I fully support you.
Mhm.
Also, River City Ransom is an RPG.
Yeah, I think my opinion on it depends, kind of like Bob's saying, like, on the execution and also like what the intent of adding the RPG elements in is. So I think if your goal is to, like, expand, like, player agency and kind of the options or variety that's presented to the player, then I think it makes a lot of sense to add RPG elements. So, like, a good example of that would be games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where they are ostensibly action games, but they lean very heavily into RPG, character building and different kind of ways you can build and structure a character that are kind of role playing through gameplay, right? Like, you can be a mage, you can be a warrior, you can be a various different hybrids of the two, or kind of create your own character, fill out your stats, and do that in a way that really feels rewarding as the player.
Mhm.
But that's all based around really good exploration and content and everything. Where I don't really like it is when I think it's deployed cynically. So, we all remember when the Suicide Squad trailer came out and they show the like Suicide Squad characters jumping around, shooting enemies, and the enemy dies and it drops like a piece of loot and it's like does 3% extra damage against like Batman infused enemies. Like that's very
Suicide Squad. I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not a game, is it? No.
Yeah. So like adding those kind of like really like grindy like loot elements or like loot treadmill elements or other kind of like leveling systems, but in a way that isn't really change like the amount of agency a player gets. Or
when they shove RPG elements into live service, that's when it gets a little bit.
Exactly. That's what I'm basically getting at, is like when it's meant to create like a psychological like response in the player where they want to keep playing, but it doesn't really add more variety or player agency. That's kind of when it bothers me.
Yeah, it's borderline predatory. And that's an excellent point, Ben. I didn't even think of that.
It also is interesting because of when you look, we tend to think about genres as, especially nowadays, they emerged fully formed, but they didn't. The genres of video games that we have today evolved out of very key places. There were puzzle games. There were side scrollers that were very, very basic, like Donkey Kong, for example. And then those evolved into Mario, and those evolved into the platformers we know today. And then there were experiences that were taken from the real world and were imported into its own genres. And that's in the case of RPGs. Role-playing games were not developed for video games. Role-playing games were developed as game systems that were meant for tabletop play and were meant for like stats and people working off sheets and things like that. The entire point of it was character progression. So when that was imported into video games, the origin of RPG as a genre, JRPGs, Western RPGs, is very different from those of other more traditional genres in video games. And because of that, because RPGs were so based on systems, it was very easy to import those systems into the other genres once those genres got far enough along in their development. So it makes sense to me that RPG mechanics work in pretty much any context, even in cynical, horrible ones like live service. Like they're systems to develop characters, and therefore they work to deepen an experience.
I feel like I'm listening to an episode of Extra Credits on YouTube. It's actually, if you're not familiar, Extra Credits is an awesome channel where they look at more of the academic side of gaming and the history of games and why things are done the way they are today. It's just beautifully stated, Jono.
It's absolutely fascinating to me. I love game history so much. Game history is still in its infancy, and like it's astounding when we look at how big the game industry has gotten in the last 30, 40 years, and consider that like right now, in terms of like if we were the film industry, we're in the early 1950s in terms of the timeline. And if we look back on the films from the early 1950s, a lot of them aren't very good. They were still figuring things out. So can you just imagine what it's going to be like in about 30 years from now when this industry keeps evolving and keeps maturing and new types of experiences are developed? Like, we've come so far in such a short time, and there is so much more room to grow. I look forward to it.
Going back to your first question when we started the podcast, like, am I frustrated by the wealth of games available to me? I've been gaming since the NES came out in the 80s. Imagine what it's like to be a kid today where you've got all the retro stuff, all the new stuff coming out. You cannot physically, there's not enough time in your lifetime to play all the good stuff out there. That's got to be daunting.
Oh God, yes, there's so much. And also there's so much in every single other genre of media. Like, how many books are released a year? How many films, television were, despite the fact that, various streaming services have said they're going to cut back, there are still countless series that are released on every single month, and that I look at it and I'm like, I want to watch that. Like, there was one called, I think it was Bodies on Netflix, and it was like a time travel murder mystery, and I was like, oh God, that sounds exactly like something I want to watch. And I have not yet, because again, there is just too much. So you just got to get real choosy. You got to get really good at trying to zero in on what your thing is. And that, I'm going to tie this into what we do. That is a reason why reviewers exist. I hate arguments that I have arguments with people in theater, especially, where they're like, there shouldn't be reviewers. Your reviewers shouldn't exist. They don't contribute anything. And I'm like, yeah, they contribute something very important, which is there's a lot of shit out there. And I don't mean in terms of quality. I just mean like there's a lot. There's a lot of
yeah.
There's so much stuff. And something that reviewers do is, and yes, it is personal taste, but if you find a reviewer that you trust, you like, and your taste fairly well aligns with them, they're going to be able to tell you, okay, here's what you're probably going to like. Let's lead you down this way. Check this out, maybe. And that is an invaluable service, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons why the site exists.
Well, you gain time, right? Beyond the dollars is like RPGs especially can be dozens of hours, sometimes even over 100 hours. So like before I make the commitment, I want to, hear someone who knows what they're talking about, someone I trust, who's going to spare me the time investment where I'm like, oh God, I got to slog through this because I'm already halfway through and I feel like I got to finish it. Like a reviewer is critical for that reason alone. Because like you said, there's just too much out there. And I can't look at every single trailer and decide and make a wise decision. I could throw a dart at a dartboard, but I'm going to miss something.
Yeah, and sometimes throwing a dart at a dartboard's great. Sometimes you discover something like I threw a dart at a dartboard when I discovered the Yakuza series. I had no interest in Yakuza. Yeah. I got assigned it by Alana, and bam! Oh my God, this connected with me. So it's amazing when that happens. However, sometimes they're not gatekeepers. Like reviewers aren't gatekeepers. Reviewers are like, well, showroom salesmen. Maybe they're like, take a look over here. Oh, here's something nice. Oh, don't look at that over there. That's Fallout 76. Keep away from that.
And that's kind of the nice thing about, RPG fan as a focused on like a handful of genres too, is that we have the ability to talk about things that a lot of other larger, more broadly focused sites aren't really going to focus their time and energy on. So if like, oh yeah, I really love RPGs, then you can come to the site and you can expect that somebody's going to be talking or writing about a game that you might be interested in that fits with your very narrow interests, and in a way that, a lot of other places where you might look for recommendations just are going to miss.
Yeah. And I mean, there are tons of sites out there like that. For example, adventuregamers.com is a site that's entirely dedicated to point and click adventure games and others in the adventure game genre. And they're like, we cover adventure games and we cover point and click adventure games. We can't even remotely cover even a tenth of what's out there. But these guys seem to do a fantastic job. Great website, by the way. Really, really strong reviews in many cases. I recommend them if you're looking for some good adventure game coverage.
I'll just try.
Yeah, what?
Audra's trying to get through all the adventure games.
Oh, Audra's trying to get through all of the adventure. Audra's trying to get through every game, period, to be fair. And so are you, Bob. And also, Ben, you're doing quite a job. And I'm just like, I just want to play like a dragon.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have no doubt I would love Yakuza, but that's like 15 games and they're all long games. I'm like, I cannot physically do it. I'm afraid of falling in love with that franchise.
I think that is a very wise decision that you've made, Bob. A very wise decision. And thankfully, because I am a greedy boss, you will never be assigned like a dragon game.
Hey, it's a win-win in my book.
All right, folks. Well, thank you very much for joining me tonight. I really, really appreciate it. If you're looking for a way to support us here at RPG Fan, we've opened a store. You can find it at www.rpgfan.com/shop. We have lots of things on there, including we're very soon going to have some more 25th anniversary merch. Our 25th anniversary is, rapidly wrapping up, considering that so is 2023. So make sure you go on there and check that stuff out. When that stuff is posted, believe me, I will give you a heads up on the show. You can also check out our past episodes of Random Encounter if you are very curious and wish to support us. Like I mentioned in the past, check out our last episode because it's a pretty darn good feature, and the way it's developing the various heats. I'm really enjoying how it's going down. We also have some other podcasts here at RPG Fan. We have Retro Encounter. And 2 weeks ago, we had a two-parter for Rhapsody Musical Adventure. So that was over the course of 2 weeks. And the last episode was our Halloween special. Solosi put it together. It's RPG Costume Party. And it's a pretty fun episode where they talk about, well, basically your favorite costumes in RPGs, which very, very timely considering it's the end of October. We also have Rhythm Encounter, which is RPG Fans' music podcast. Last week, we had Party in the GTA, and it was an episode, actually, again, hosted by Solosi. And in it, they talked about basically Game Boy Advanced music. And the Game Boy Advance, interesting because it did have an underpowered sound chip. Really some good music came out of that era. So absolutely check that episode out. If you'd like to get in contact with us here at Random Encounter, you can fire us off a message at podcast@rpgfan.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any ideas for future episodes, if you have any discussion questions, D. Brown, thank you very, very much for yours. If anyone out there wishes to have us discuss your question on the show, please send one in. If you'd like to send me an email, you can do so at jlogan@rpgfan.com. You can also find me on Mastodon at johnologan@mastodon.social. And I am not the only person on this podcast to have an online presence. Bob, where can we find you online?
bob@rpgfan.com.
Perfect.
I love emails.
Cool. And Ben, where can we find you online?
Yeah, benloganlove@gmail.com.
Cool. All right. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. You can help us get the word out there. You can also rate us on iTunes or your other podcast player of choice. Again, Ben, Bob, thank you so very much for joining me this evening. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you spending your evening with me talking about these games that you spent hours playing.
Thank you for having me. Always a joy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It was great.
Thank you both. And to everyone out there listening, whatever you're playing, have fun.